Today is the 18th of September 2014. My name is Norbert Meyn and I'm here to talk to Anita Lasker-Wallfisch. Anita, we're here to talk about your life, your musical career, your husband, Peter Wallfisch. But perhaps at the very beginning, could you just tell us when and where you were born, and could you tell us a bit about your parents as well?
Well, I was born on the 17th of July 1925 in Breslau, which is now called Wrocław, because it is Polish now. It was German then. And I come from a typical German Jewish family where the main accent was really on culture, education, music, literature, etc. Typical what we call a Jecke family. Not practicing Jews in the sense that, you know, we ate kosher or anything like that. To be Jewish was just by the way, you know.
Could you say a few words about your family?
Well, my father was a lawyer and a very musical man. He loved to sing, and my mother was a very, very accomplished violinist. But in those days, of course, when one had children who didn't pursue the profession, I mean, she never stopped playing the violin. We had that's, I suppose, how I got into this music. We always had chamber music in the house. There were always quartet sessions, and there was an orchestra in Breslau. My mother was, I think she was leading the orchestra, I don't know. I mean, she certainly always, I remember in the evening when I was in bed, I heard her taking the violin out and playing always the octaves of the Beethoven, starting off with the octaves of the Beethoven violin concerto. So there was always music. Music was a completely natural thing to have in the house, yeah.
When did you start playing the cello?
Well, I must have, I don't know why my eye was on the cello, because I have a picture of myself pretending to play the cello when I was about 3 years old, sitting on the floor with a broomstick, a sort of children's broom, and a comb, and music in front of me and singing. So my parents must have seen that funny child doing this, said, well, maybe we'll buy her a cello. And they bought me a quarter-sized cello, which was small enough for my mother to actually play the violin on. That's how it started. Somehow the cello fascinated me, yeah.
So at the age of 13, you traveled to Berlin to study the cello with Leo Rostal.
People started emigrating like crazy, you know, when it was obvious what is afoot. And there was a situation when there was not a Jewish cello teacher to be found in Breslau. And I remember exactly that my mother must have tried to find an Aryan cello teacher. Because I remember now, as if it was yesterday, somebody coming into the house, me playing to this guy, and him saying, I'm terribly sorry, I daren't do it. That was, you couldn't, as a German Aryan, be seen teaching a Jewish child. So it was then decided, oh yes, then came a situation, you know, by that time we had the Kulturbund Orchestra, which were Jewish orchestras, because Jews were not allowed to pursue their professions, but for some reason they could do it within a Jewish context. So there was the Kulturbund Orchestra in Berlin, and the brother of Max Rostal, Leo Rostal, came to Breslau to play a concerto with the Breslau Kulturbund Orchestra. And as soon as a musician was in Breslau, they always came to our flat, etc., etc. And I remember that quite well, that my mother said, spiel mal was vor, you know, play something to this guy, which I did. And he said, yes, I would love to teach her. In 4 years' time, she'll be, God knows what, important cellist. And why don't you send her to Berlin? Because there was a difference living in Berlin or in Breslau. Breslau was such a small place. I mean, compared to Berlin, people knew each other. In Berlin, you could disappear. So it was still possible somehow, yeah. So it was decided that I would be sent to Berlin, which needed the permission from the Gestapo. It also needed permission that I leave school, because I was schulpflichtig. All this was arranged, and I was sent to Berlin to study with Leo Rostal, which really I'm extremely grateful for, although it didn't last very long. He gave me somehow a basis where I could become a cellist eventually after 8 years of nothing in between. Yeah, so, but I mean, that didn't last very long because then came Kristallnacht, 9th of November, and everything exploded, so to say, and I had a phone call from my mother, come home immediately, etc., etc. That was the end of my cello studies, quasi, yeah.
What was the musical environment like in Berlin at the time? And could you say a few words about Leo Rostal?
The funny thing is that I was sent a book from Germany. Somebody's written a book about the Rostal brothers, where I learned for the first time that Leo Rostal actually was a dentist, but obviously an extremely gifted cellist. Well, it transpired that when the Rostal brothers were very young, apparently their parents took them to the local fiddle teacher, and they must have been aged 3 or 4 or something, you know, and he thought he'll take Max because Leo was already too old or something, a crazy story. So in order to learn a proper profession, send him to be a dentist. I didn't know that till I read that book. But he was a very, very good cellist. That is absolutely without any doubt, and a very good teacher, yeah.
What happened when you had to come back to Breslau?
It was a sort of very peculiar period. I went back to Breslau, and I think my father understood that it is imperative to leave. Because, you know, my father was a very, very German, you know, Iron Cross in the First World War, etc. He couldn't imagine that the Germans would be that stupid. But they were that stupid, and but then it was too late, and everybody tried to go somewhere, and, you know, as night follows day, frontiers closed, and it became unspeakably difficult to find anywhere to go. And, you know, one was still quite naive in those days. My father was a lawyer. How can you earn a living as a German lawyer, you know, abroad? I mean, had one known what's coming, never mind, you know, you become a taxi driver or whatever. Anyhow, it was all too late. But the period between my going back to Breslau and everything exploding was quite peculiar, because one didn't sort of notice too much. Life still went on more or less. You know, one could kid oneself, this will finish one day. But then, of course, came the moment when we had to leave our apartment. You see, in Breslau, there wasn't the sort of ghetto that we would find in Poland, but Jews had to leave their apartments and go somewhere else. You know, one was sort of pushed aside. We finished then up in an apartment of my aunt, where there were already other people living. I mean, it was pretty terrible, completely cramped. And I started getting bored, because, you know, what was I doing here? You know, we're trying to emigrate, or... So I went back to school again, because I'd left school. So like a maniac, I tried to catch up with all the time that I've left out at school. I managed to get back into my class, but soon schools closed. You know, everything sort of broke down. Schools closed, and then came the time that Jewish people at the age of 16, I think, had to be conscripted to work. So I finished up in a paper factory producing toilet rolls, and not play the cello anymore. And during that period, then the deportation started. Yes, the war, you see, when I went back to Breslau, the war hadn't broken out yet, but then when the war broke out, you knew you were trapped, and that was it.
What happened to you and your family during the war is almost unspeakable, and very well documented in your book, Inherit the Truth, which I recommend to everyone who sees this interview. Do read it. It is one of the most extraordinary documents about the time.
I know this book is unusual because I have so many proofs of what I'm telling. I can actually prove. But what is unfortunately not, because it was a problem to actually get it into the book, is the Vermögens, what was it called?
Vermögenserklärung?
Erklärung. Because only got one page in it because it got too small. But I've got the whole thing here. I've got a copy of it. That shows you this complete madness of what's going on. My parents were told in 24 hours you have to report to the Gestapo at a certain place. And within that time, he had to write down what we own. By that time, we didn't own very much anymore. But if you see written there that 3 pairs of slippers, 10 marks, 1 table, 5 marks. We had to write everything down he owns because you stopped owning it now. It is now ours. This is so absurd. And then I've got this unspeakable correspondence that when my parents had left the apartment, the Gestapo writes to somebody, the Jew Lasker is now, there is no such word in English, abgehauen or something, and you can have his apartment. So a letter follows, I've now got the apartment, but the stove is missing. The cooking stove is missing. So you wouldn't believe it, but by that time I was already in prison. A Gestapo man came into prison and asked me, what did your father do with that stove? I said to him, he did not unscrew it, put it on his back when he was deported. I mean, such was the stupidity, boundless stupidity of these Gestapo people. This Jew has stolen the cooking stove. I mean, I don't know. It is hard to understand today the mentality of these people.
Yeah. You were working in a paper factory with your sister. You spoke French at home every week, and you got involved with some French prisoners of war there. You forged documents for them on your father's typewriter. The Gestapo then caught on to you. You were arrested on the train station as you were preparing to leave Breslau. You were then in some ways lucky to be in the judicial system where you were tried and then imprisoned for a crime rather than deported as most other Jewish inhabitants of Breslau had been by that time.
There was obviously a sort of bad feeling between these two, because you can imagine you study law and suddenly it doesn't apply anymore. I will never know exactly, but I rather think that somebody, because my father was quite a well-known lawyer, that one of his colleagues tried to drag us over rather to the judicial people. You know, wasn't all that judicial either, but was better than, because everybody who was arrested with us was sent more or less straight away to Auschwitz. So we had a sort of, we were lucky to remain in prison for a considerable time, because every day that you're not in a concentration camp was a day gained. And so that was lucky that we were criminals. First criminals, then Jews. Jews is bad enough, but criminal is better.
When you arrived in Auschwitz, you were identified as a cellist.
No, well, I'll tell you, when I arrived in Auschwitz, knowing full well what is expecting me there, you go through the ceremony where people shave your hair and tattoo a number on your arm and take your clothes off you. And this is all done by prisoners. And the girl who did this, they all thought everybody was starved for news. They thought I was coming from outside. Of course, I didn't. What's going on? How long is the war? And what did you do? What's your name? You know, you're always trying to find some sort of contact with normality. So, what did you do before the war? And I said I used to play the cello. I mean, it was such a crazy thing to say there, you know, naked, without hair. And she said, fantastic. There's a band here. They can use you. This is how I ended up in this orchestra, which was just fairly newly established, because there was a sort of rivalry. I only learned after the war that there was a band in every concentration camp, except in the women's department of Auschwitz. And two of the, the guards there, I suppose it was a matter of, if they have a band, we should also have a band, or something like that. But by the when I arrived, they didn't have a cello yet, so it was all funny instruments, you know. And so, yeah, I was a godsend suddenly. Somebody can play low notes. So this is how it happened, and in a way that was, of course, yeah, I mean, people think that it was such, because there was a lifesaver in as long as they want a ban, it would be stupid to put us in the gas chamber. You know, there's sort of certain logic about it. When it lasted till the Russian front came nearer, and then Auschwitz started to get cleaned up, etc., etc. And that was the end of the music in Bergen-Belsen.
What was it like to make music under these circumstances?
Music is something that lifts you out of the reality of life, yes? And I mean, the fantastic thing about this particular orchestra was that it was, the boss was Alma Rosé, who of course came from a musical aristocracy unrivaled. I mean, you know, niece of Gustav Mahler, and I mean, she had standards which were completely unattainable by this crazy collection of funny people that we were. And she was very, very strict, and we were very scared of Alma. I often think back, we were more scared of Alma than of anything else, because, you know, she would punish us if we played wrong notes, and she gets blamed for it. I rather admire, in retrospect, I mean, not many people are still alive of those days, but we've come to the consensus that this was a lifesaver. She forced us somehow into not looking out, you know, look at the music, play a wrong note, how terrible. It's better to do that than looking at the smoke, where you are going to be soon. It was something like that. I mean, it's difficult for normal people to understand such a situation, but that was, I mean, I have in retrospect, although she was strict and she punished me also for playing wrong notes, the greatest respect for her, that she was able to do that.
Then towards the end of the war, as the Eastern Front was approaching, you were taken to Bergen-Belsen.
Mm-hmm.
And could you say a few words about that period?
Only the Jewish people of the orchestra were sent to Belsen. We were then, so it was a matter of line up in front of the block, Jews one side, non-Jews to the other, and we were put on a kettle truck and sent to Belsen. You know, people ask me, what was worse, Belsen? It was different. In Auschwitz, the best, the shortest way to describe it, in Auschwitz they had ways of killing us in a very sophisticated, fantastic manner. In Belsen they didn't need the apparatus, one just died in Belsen. Belsen was completely the... yeah, there was nothing, there was no food, nothing. And Belsen, you just died. That's all there was to it.
I am very glad that you were strong enough to survive under these circumstances.
I was lucky. It's nothing to do with strength. You know, people have always asked, how could you possibly survive that? Almost implying that maybe you did something wrong, you collaborated with the Germans. Survival was completely arbitrary. There were people sent from Belsen shortly before we were liberated to Theresienstadt. It meant in real terms that these people were only liberated at the end of the war, and some people died on the way. Arbitrary. I could have been one of those, you know. Where you happened to be when was whether you survived or you didn't. Nothing to do with whether you were strong or just lucky.
And you then worked as a translator for the British Army without initially knowing English, but you learned it within weeks, I think. And then you also had the chance to play the cello again for the first time.
Yeah, it's quite a story how I managed to get a cello. I drove everybody crazy for a cello, you know. But I was, you know, decent enough. I always said, don't steal a cello from a cellist. I know what that's like. Anyhow, they produced a, I don't know whether to go into all these details here now, a rather terrible cello, but I thought it was like a Stradivarius. When I came with that cello to England, actually it's quite funny, I thought it was a fantastic cello. And I had my first cello lesson with Bill Pleath. He looked at it and he said, nobody can play on a thing like that. And immediately managed to borrow a more or less playable cello for me. So, you know, everything is relative in life. I thought it was fantastic to just have a cello, you know.
And then your sister and you made a plan to go to England to live there. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, you know, we were liberated. It was unbelievable to be liberated. I mean, you couldn't believe it. You thought you were dreaming. And then, which actually is very poignant in my book when I started, although there was no postal service, it was all very complicated, correspondence with my sister again, how the mood in Belsen started to go down, because first of all, Belsen became a sort of collecting place for the people who were liberated in other parts of Germany. Not everybody was liberated in a camp. There were actual people in Germany walking about in that completely destroyed country who had been in a concentration camp. But nobody looked after them. And nobody helped them because the Germans themselves were in a terrible situation. Anyhow, there's books written about that. So with the result that a lot of people came into Belsen who were not actually liberated. The Belsen became a sort of Auffangslager. And it became more and more dreadful, really. Although we were very privileged because we worked for the British Army and we had our little house. And yeah, but this is what it was like. It was getting pretty terrible in Belsen, even as a liberated person. And then where do we go? You know, people don't realize what a terrible problem it was to actually deal with this funny lot of people who were there. The problem for the British Army. What do we do? Send you home? I'm not going home to Breslau. What do I do there? People from Poland certainly didn't want to go back to Poland. I mean, dreadful things happened to people who returned to their houses and found Polish people living there. They didn't want them, and a lot of people were killed there as well. I mean, terrible stories are attached to that. We will not get into that right now. But we had nowhere to go, really, and with the greatest of difficulties. And a little bit of forgery as well about birth dates. We managed to come to England, but 11 months after the liberation. It took a long time.
You then managed to get to Brussels, and there you were waiting to get permission to go to England.
I finished up at the university. Somebody said, you know, there is an orchestra at the Brussels University, and maybe they can use the cello. So that's where I went. I said, look, I play the cello. Can I join the orchestra? Yes. And can I find somewhere to practice? Yes. So they gave me a room in the cellar. There's a whole story attached to that as well. Maybe it is too much for this, for the purposes here. But if I think of the standards that people need now, I was practicing in that cellar room without a window, and I put a little mirror up, I think, to see whether I'm doing it. You know. Yeah, standards have changed somehow. Now people need all the comfort. And anyhow, finally I arrived in England.
What was it like to arrive in England in 1946?
I tell you something, we've heard that they've got double-decker buses in London. And my sister and I arrived at Victoria Station, and because of the hour difference of the continent and England, my cousin who was supposed to collect us wasn't there. So I remember that I said to my sister, we had a little bit of luggage and a cello, go outside and have a look what it looks like here in London. Maybe we can see these funny buses. There, it's true, they're double-decker buses. Anyhow, that was my first memory, to see these buses. And then my cousin came, and he did not take us straight home where we were supposed to live, but showed us Big Ben. We had a little tour, and he explained to us that the small hand of Big Ben is as big as a man. A lot of people don't even know that, but I learned that straight away. Yes, and I was... then we came to London, and of course my cousin lived in a very small cottage, but he'd bought like a garden hut. He was very clever with his hands. So we lived in a garden hut where everything was there, a little basin and a little stove and 2 beds. Yeah, it was a bit complicated, but to us it was, you know, fantastic. And yeah, so my life in London started in a garden hut.
And what happened next? So how did you go about starting your life in London?
The funny thing happened, you know, when I was very young, I was a complete admirer of Casals. And I wrote to Casals, actually, before the war, telling me that I want to learn the cello, and that was still when one thought perhaps you could go to France and get away from Germany. I would very much like to study in France and something like that. And I had a letter back, unfortunately, of course I haven't got it. It was a wonderful handwriting. It'd be very nice if you could come and study at the École Normale with Maurice Eisenberg and etc. Fine. So now I was in, a very funny story actually happened. When I was in Belsen after the liberation, yes, I'm not writing about that, I was walking along the Lagerstraße and a soldier approached me and said, "Are you Anita Lasker?" I said, "Yes." "Casals is looking for you." Well, I fainted straight. "What do you mean Casals is looking for me?" It was this crazy story here. It transpired that Casals had sort of admirer, somebody called Millie Stanfield. She used to write articles in the Strad paper, cellistic landmarks or something. She was somehow connected with Casals. What must have happened? It is quite a complicated story. You know, Casals never played in countries that didn't behave properly, but after the war he came for the first time and played a concert at the Albert Hall. I don't know whether you know about that. I heard about that as a liberated person in Belsen, and I tried to listen to it, played the Elgar concerto or something, I don't know. But couldn't hear it. But somebody said to me, "You know, you should write to Casals again." Said, "I'm still here, you know, and I still want to start," etc., etc. And what must have happened that Casals got that letter, showed it to his secretary, Millie Stanfield, and said, "Look, there is this Anita Lasker in Belsen who wants to be a cellist, look after her." And Millie Stanfield had a chauffeur who was conscripted into the army and was sent to Belsen and said, "Well, try and look for this girl." You said, a crazy story, which did not have such a happy ending, because then I got in touch with this Millie Stanfield, you see, and she promised, I've got all the correspondence still, "If you come to London, we'll look after you, you can study with blah, 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 blah." It turned out, it's too long a story not to go into, to be absolutely stupid, and nothing ever happened. You know, she invited me then to meet Maurice Eisenberg at the Dorchester Hotel and asked me to come in evening dress. You know, I'd just come back from Belsen, I didn't have many evening dresses. And it turned out that she was a really very conceited society lady. And so what do I do now? But I'd already seen Bill Please play at the you know, these lunchtime concerts at the National Gallery. I thought, he looks very, very fine cellist, you know. And then I came back from this terrible meeting at the Dorchester Hotel, obviously, which didn't work out. And my cousin said to me, "You know, I know the father of William Please. He's a hairdresser. I'll ring him up and say if Anita couldn't study with him." And that's how it happened. But the funny story is, then I went to Bill Please with my stupid little concertos that I could play, and he was fantastic. When he was 70, all the Bill Please pupils gave a concert for him at the Wigmore Hall. And by that time I was a senior member of the clan, and there was a party after the concert, and I said to Bill, "You know," I was actually going to make a speech, but you know, it's too much going on here. But you know, I never forget my first lesson. I said, "You know, I was so scared with my stupid little concerto." I said, "You were scared?" "I was scared. I've never given a lesson in my life before." I was his first pupil. I said, "Now you're telling me after all these years." You know, that was really a very nice story. Well, he was wonderful. Well, I finished up with Bill Please, and yeah, and I think I have to thank him that I ever got back to cello playing again after all these years, you know. So that's how it happened.
So in the late 1940s then, did you meet many other émigré musicians?
Yes, I think back actually I met nothing but refugee musicians. I mean, my cousin with whom I lived was, you know, very musical lady, and she knew Eddie May. Eddie May was a doctor and a very, very accomplished amateur cellist, and he had a lot of musical parties. And for somehow I must have gone there, and I met people like Maria Lidka. Who else was there? I don't know, somehow there was a community, and there was regular chamber music, it was all very interesting. Eddie May used to collect famous people. I know that Rostropovich was there. I think he must have gone to the airport and wondered who's arriving and then invited them. And it was always very nice because he was also a very good cook. So I met Maria there, and well, you name it, really. Everybody seemed to be playing at Eddie May's parties. And then I very soon met Tamara Osborne, who was Franz Osborne's ex-wife. I don't know, there was this famous duo of Osborne and Rostal. And there, she was teaching everybody who was living in the vicinity of, she was a very fine pianist in Golders Green, and there I met, yeah, it didn't take long that I met a lot of people, and thinking back of it, they were all refugees, really.
Did you meet the Amadeus Quartet?
I met them even before they were a quartet. You know, it is so long ago, it's difficult to me now. I met him. I know I met Martin, whose parents lived opposite here, actually. And he was trying to give me some cello lessons as well. Yes, I met them also quite soon. I think word must have gone around if somebody, a cellist, was missing. Well, there's this Anita, you can phone her up. That I played in an orchestra which was a little orchestra, actually it was directed by a woman, I forget now the name of it. And I think Norbert was leading it and Sigmund was playing in it, you know. I mean, we were all very much at the beginning of our musical activity. And then, how did that come about? Oh yes, and I still lived in my garden house with my cousin, which sort of became a bit difficult, and I thought it was time to move out. By that time I had met Kay Hurwitz, Emanuel Hurwitz's wife. She wasn't his wife then yet. And I thought I'll ring up Kay and ask her if she knows of a room for me to move into. And that resulted that, in fact, I moved into a house where Kay and Manny were living upstairs, and downstairs was a BBC producer by the name of Leonard Isaacs. Doesn't mean anything to you anymore. And so my great friendship with the Hurwitzes started. And eventually we had to move out from there and move into another house. And then I lived in a sort of musical community, you know, lots of musicians, because the names perhaps don't mean anything to you anymore now. It was Mary Long and Granville Jones and Manny, and he had his quartet there. And that's then how the idea of the English Chamber Orchestra started. Then Manny said to me one day, you know, I want to form a chamber orchestra, would you like to join? By that time, I was at the Guildhall School, was already a member of so many little orchestras that never, you know, we always tried to earn some money, and never anything happened. And I said to Manny, you know, I don't think I have time to do that. I said, come along, it'll be fun. Well, needless to say that all the other orchestras don't exist anymore. And that was the beginning of the English Chamber Orchestra. Then we met in a church in Holborn. Most of the people were still in uniform. We're talking now about the late 40s, I think. And Arnold Goldsborough was in charge. I don't know whether that name means anything. He was then the Baroque guru. You know, things have changed a lot. And we started rehearsing this piece and always hoping to maybe get a date. And then we did get a date with the BBC, and I still know what was the pay in those days. £3 a concert and £1.10 a rehearsal. that was the money you got. Mind you, of course, it meant a lot more than now.
So how did this group become the English Chamber Orchestra?
Well, it was really thanks to Ursula Strabier. Her father, she was Swiss, her father had connections with the Lucerne Festival, etc. We suddenly became international. And with the Goldsborough, you can't, so we became the English Chamber Orchestra, you know, and the rest is history. I mean, you know, we had a fantastic time, and and really played with everybody everywhere, you know, I mean, yeah.
How did your own performing career develop?
It didn't take long, you know, I sort of came to London, somehow word went round there is a cellist that could be useful. I was asked to go to music camp. I never even heard of that. There's something, it still exists, you will not believe it. It's a typical English, beautiful amateur, sorry. It's an amateur scientist, crazy on music, established this music camp where anybody who can play anything could go. And it was a very organized thing, you know, you played big orchestra and then symphony orchestra, and then you could have chamber music. It was all done in the country. We used to meet, anyhow, they phoned me up and said, would I come and lead the cello section? So I went, and I mean, I felt like a complete fool because it was full of very accomplished amateur cellists. I think I was sitting next, so I was supposed to be leading this orchestra, next to quite a well-known composer who knew much more about the music we were playing than I did. But anyhow, I survived it, and there I met a lot of people like Peter Gellhorn, Colin Davis, you know, we're all in the beginning of their careers. A wonderful invention, this music camp. I mean, I only went for 2 years running because I've still got the diary, what we played there. I played the cello from 8 in the morning till midnight. My fingers got shorter, I mean, but I learned there from all the other people for the first time. I played the Beethoven septet, Schubert octet, Spohr nonet. How can you do that? It was all the music was there, and we played in barns, and fantastic. It's still going on. I mean, the guy who invented it is no longer alive, but people still go there. I stopped going there after 2 years because I was so busy myself then suddenly, you see. But there I met a lot of people that you're interested in, like Colin Davis, very much at the beginnings of his career, you know.
How did you meet your husband, Peter Wallfisch?
When I was at the Guildhall School, I had a quartet. And the leader of the quartet was Eric Grünberg. And at that time, my sister was married to a Frenchman who had a student room in Paris. I don't know whether you know what a student room means in Paris. But anyway, we will have a rehearsal with Eric, and I said, look, I'm not here next week. I'm going to Paris for the first time. I've never been to Paris. I have a medal from the French government, but I've never been to France, you know. So he said, well, there's somebody there who you might know. His name is Peter Wallfisch. I said, of course I know Peter Wallfisch. I went to school with him. I give you his address if you like. So he gave me his address. So I went to Paris, stayed in a student room. You should know what a student room is like in Paris. The French people are not very nice to their domestic servants. You know, you have these enormous buildings with beautiful apartments, and on the very top is for the maids' rooms. The maids' rooms, with one room after the other, completely simple, just a bed, a chair, one cold tap outside for all of them. I mean, talk about primitive, yes, but you know, who cares? I was in Paris, it was very hot, and I looked around Paris and I was completely bowled over, of course. In those days, people of your generation wouldn't know that, but bananas were not, nobody had ever eaten a banana for ages. But in Paris there were bananas, so I ate bananas all day long, and looked around Paris, having the address of this Peter Wallfisch in my pocket, but I had no intention of going to see him. But I accidentally passed his hotel. He was living in a hotel that was also the sort of, students lived in hotels. I thought I might as well go in. So I went in there and I said, Monsieur Wallfisch, you know, he's n'est pas là. So I left a note, Anita Lasker, Schule Breslau, you know, and I thought I'd done my duty. A couple of days later, I was again in that vicinity. He lived very near Opera, very nice district. So I'll see, maybe he's in now. And he was in, so, and we got on very well. But apparently my first question was, what do you live on, you know? I mean, he was also a student. Well, Peter's story is that he actually left Germany at the very last minute, because there was a not completely legal arrangement, I think I found out later. There was a certain man by the name of Hauser in Palestine who wanted to save Jewish talented children. And he must have come, I mean, I know that from hearsay, come to Germany and Austria to find people that he could possibly save into Palestine. And I think it was under these circumstances that people like Erich Grünberg and his brother Eli Goren and Peter Wallfisch, and I could name a few others, of course, were saved into Palestine as children. Because what must have happened is there was news went round that the guy is coming, look for talented children, so all the mothers got their talented children out to play to this guy. And Peter was one of them, and was then eventually went to Palestine, was very unhappy there. Can you imagine for a child to go to where he can't speak the language? And that is how he ended up there. And I suppose people like Erich Grünberg was a similar story. When the war was finished, most of these people tried to leave Palestine to continue with their studies in wherever. So Eric came to England to study with Rostal. Peter, the way he got out for the first time from Palestine is there was a competition which is still going on in Geneva, international competition. He went to this competition, didn't win, but won a scholarship to study in Paris. Somebody heard him and said, this guy must be helped. That's how he finished up in Paris, to study then with Marguerite Long and with Jacques Février. I don't know whether these names mean anything to you. That's why he was in Paris, you see.
Did you know him well in Breslau, and did you know his family?
I didn't know him well at all. He was a fat boy who was a good pianist. And I still, because Peter was a bit of a hoarder, has still a program, and I've got it now, where we both appeared at the pupils' concert as Peter Wallfisch, Brahms Intermezzo or something, and Anita Lasker. Yeah. No, I didn't take any notice of him. But you know, we were both, in a way, not where we should be. So, of course, we had a lot in common. And, yeah, that's how it started. But, I mean, you know, we had enormous difficulties. And then Peter, of course, at that competition, he must have met somebody who came from Hungary, who said to him, I'm not going back to Hungary. We're talking about communist times now. But there is a competition going on, it might interest you, a Bartok competition. And I can give you my return ticket. You know, things were very difficult. So Peter went. If he hadn't won, he wouldn't have had the money to come back. He only had somebody else's return ticket. And went in for the Bartok competition, which he won. Yeah, that's how he's... But it was also very complicated because we're very much in communist times now. He went back to Hungary several times to play, even with Klemperer. I've got a nice photograph of him. But when he eventually finished up in England, the fact that he played a lot behind the Iron Curtain was a bit suspect, you know. I mean, it's difficult enough for a pianist to make a career anyway, but to make a career when you have got a lot of political, peculiar things behind you, it was difficult to jump over that hurdle that he played in communist countries. Anyway, that is Peter Wallfisch. And finally, you know, with great difficulty, he got permission to live in England. I spent some time in Paris, and he would come to London. But these were the days when I needed always a re-entry visa to England. You always needed visas, you know. But we sort of, there was a shuttle service going on. And then Eric Grünberg got married and invited Peter to his wedding. And so Peter came to London for the first time, perhaps not so much to the wedding as that we should be together again. And then we started this crazy shuttle service between Paris and London. And then we decided to get married, and I thought, wait till I'm British. Because once I'm British, maybe if I marry somebody who is not British, he will have permit to live in this country. Well, I made a mistake. You have to be born here. So to be British was not enough to get Peter Aufenthaltserlaubnis. So we had a terrible, by that time I was pregnant, and where are we going to live? You know, we would have probably have to go back to Palestine, or Israel by then. And then something quite unbelievable happened that, you know, Tamara Osborne that I mentioned before, who was married to, used to play regularly at the club in Green Street called the Allied Circle. It doesn't exist anymore. There was during the war where people from various friendly nationalities used to meet. And she phoned up and said, you know, I'm supposed to play tonight at this Allied Circle, but I'm not feeling well. Would you go instead of me? You get a free meal. Well, you know, lovely. Of course we go for a free meal. We go anywhere. So Peter went to this club, and this was quite an unbelievable story. The very nice lady was the sort of director of it, and I don't know what he played, but she was completely bowled over and asked us various questions, like, for instance, where do you live, actually? I said, well, it's actually a very good question. We live mainly on a boat. And she seemed to be interested in that story, and she said, would you write that down for me? And that was at the time when Peter was in London. We used to go to the Home Office and queue up, you know, like, so you move from one chair to the other and talk to somebody, and I remember it was a very smoggy day, you know, where you could hardly move, and tell my story and said, couldn't you give this guy a permit to live here? Yeah, I don't want my child born, you know, on a boat or whatever. But he's not a refugee, and he's not no, blah, blah, no, I'm sorry. We go home again, what we're going to do. When the phone went, Home Office on the phone, would you mind coming to the Home Office? As I've just been. No, we would like to see you and your husband. I mean, it was a crazy situation. So back we go, and suddenly the world has changed. The doors were open for us. We were ushered into what is going on? We finish up in a room. A man sits with a folder in front of him. Peter Wallfisch, minister's case. To cut a very long story short, this lady in that club was friendly with Rab Butler. You are too young to know who Rab Butler was. He was our Home Secretary in those days, and for once a man with tremendous culture. Not what we've got now. And this lady must have phoned him up and said, Rab, you know, I've just heard a young man here. He would be a real asset to the cultural life in Britain. Why can't you? No problem. You know, suddenly what is the hugest problem is no problem. Suddenly Peter Wallfisch was a minister. Of course you can live in England. This is how it happened. And you know, the nice thing, I must say that to my admiration for British people is this lady who completely is responsible for my life, really. Because we would have had to go to Palestine. My son would have been in the army, probably dead, and we're a completely different story. She never, ever expected anything. If she would have said, look, you come every week and play now, nothing. It was the most beautiful, discreet, typical English way of dealing. Of course, we thanked her, we saw her several times, but I mean, this lady completely saved our lives. This is all accidents, you see. So Tamara Osborne can't play, so Peter plays, she likes the way he plays. Yeah, it's crazy.
So what were his next steps to establish himself as a pianist?
To be a pianist is not a thing to be recommended in any way. You know, there are some on the very top, and everybody else has to struggle really dreadfully. It was difficult. He won then another prize in Germany, whatever that was called, I can't remember. Munich competition, yeah. So he got concerts, but it was a big struggle, and I was really, at the beginning, I was the earner. It took a long time before he established himself. And when he started, then he got the job at the college. which was, of course, for his pupils something very special, because he brought something, of course, that only people with his background could bring to the college. Because when he was studying in Jerusalem Conservatoire, the professors were all people who would probably not normally have been professors at the conservatoire. There was a collection of the most important musicians were there from all over the place, with the result that Peter's musical education was so enormously comprising. You know, it's difficult to explain, but his pupils will tell you that Peter's teaching was unusual, you know. Yeah.
What was he like as a musician, as a performer, and what composers did he play really well?
Well, I think still Brahms number 2, the way he starts that is second to none. I mean, yeah, he was a Brahms, very much a Brahms man, but he was also very interested in English music. And this is a tradition that my son has obviously continued. It's really rather unusual. These Jewish refugees do so much for English music, yeah. I think he was difficult to play with because he couldn't stand these ad hoc, suddenly, oh, we get together, we have one rehearsal. He was very much, I suppose, the old German tradition, into detail and has to be really worked out, and yeah. You have to ask people who actually played with him to. I don't think he was easy to play with, to work with. I mean, he had a duo with Maria Lidka. Well, unfortunately, she's no longer with us, so she can't tell us too much about it. But they obviously had the same sort of background, so they got on very well. He played with Christopher Bunting. I don't know whether that name... It's terrible how these names, who were really big names, don't exist anymore. Fantastic cellist. Yeah.
What would you say were his greatest successes?
So we never thought in terms of successes somehow. You know, as long as there was work and you could, yeah, I couldn't really say what his great success is. I mean, the duo with his son, that was very nice because he was very clever to not have a duo straight away with his son, you know, father and son. He really waited till Raphael was established more or less as a cellist that they played together. He hated recording. But there are some recordings, of course, of his. And then he got very fascinated with English music and was a great friend of Kenneth Layton, and I think he's done a lot for English music. Yeah.
So Peter became a professor at the Royal College of Music in 1973. What was that like for him?
Well, he was very happy. I mean, his pupils absolutely adored him. I mean, he got on very well with his pupils. I don't think the establishment was so pleased with him because he couldn't stand these stupid meetings about, you know, scales and arpeggio. It was a complete waste of time. You know, you probably know about these things, sort of faculty meetings. Yes, he always spoke his mind. His thought was completely, well, I don't know exactly what went on. But his pupils, absolutely, I mean, I'm still in touch with some of them.
Could you say something about Maria Lidka?
Well, Maria Lidka imported Germany completely to England. I mean, she never changed. Yeah, which actually, it was a pity in a way because she was a fantastic fiddle player, but she never really integrated into the musical family in London, you know, like I was lucky enough, I belonged just to that crowd, you know. Because everything was, of course, better in Germany. That is without any question. Yeah. I don't know what she was a very amusing person. She was quite a bad driver, and she only drove in streets where there was nobody else in, you know. She was quite an amusing person, but she was a very good violinist. And I mean, her devotion to violin playing, I mean, when she was nearly 100, she was still practicing studies. I mean, I ask you, you've got to be crazy to do that.
So she performed together with your husband and she became a professor at the Royal College.
Yeah, yeah, I'm sure she was a very good teacher because she had very good teaching. I'm sure she was very strict. I remember she made me always feel terrible because she used to, when I met her at these musical parties at Eddie May's, she used to say, what are you learning at the moment? I'd say, well, I'm playing, I don't know, Haydn concert. Ah, that's terrible. You should play studies and scales and arpeggios. So I go to Bill Please and say, I was told I should play studies. He said, well, if you want to, go on, play a study. You should take the evening standard and read. And he said, you finished? You know, completely different way of teaching, yeah. Which was lucky for me. I couldn't have survived the studies and the scales forever. But Maria was taught in that way, and you know, she wasn't going to shift from the way she did it in Germany.
What was her playing like?
Very good, very good. No, I mean, you can't fault it. She played extremely well. And the violin was, you know, was part of her. I mean, she played even at very advanced age. I remember people playing quartets with her, and you know, she always used to shush people. Shh! You know? I mean, it's all very funny. But she took it very seriously, her music, yeah. No, she was very good.
Could you say a few words about your friend Alice Herz-Sommer?
Alice Herz-Sommer, yeah. Well, I mean, I met her really through Peter, because Alice, when she came out of Theresienstadt, went back to Prague, where she found tremendous anti-Semitism, plus ça change, and finished up in Israel, where she became a teacher at the conservatoire and got very friendly with Peter Wallfisch's teacher at that time. So when she came, then I remember her visiting us in London, in our flat where we used to live with hundreds of stairs up, because her son, Raphael, was thinking of moving to London, and because we were the oldies and we could give some advice. Well, I mean, he moved finally to London, and then Alice moved to London, and I visited her even then with Peter, but I was only the chauffeur because they kept talking about the days in Jerusalem, you see. And then Peter died, and then tragically Alice's son died. And that's when I started visiting her, really, in my own right sort of thing. And it became a sort of tradition, because you could park there on Saturday. Mind you, twice I got a ticket even on Saturday. That I started visiting her on Saturday afternoons, and it became a tradition that went on nearly for 15 years. And we played Scrabble, and she was a very, at that time when we started, really very entertaining person. She knew Kafka, you know, she was from she seemed to me like I must seem to you now, you know. So we had a very nice time together, and she was really an unbelievable person. She even managed to console herself over her son's death. Can you imagine? She was a woman who lost her husband in Theresienstadt. Then she had this fantastic relationship with her son, whom she protected in Theresienstadt to such a degree, he was 6 years old, that he had good memories of Theresienstadt. Can you imagine? Then when they grew up, he protected his mother. He got her this flat in London finally, and really a tragedy that this man had to die. Yes, and then, you know, I spent every Saturday afternoon with her. But gradually, Scrabble playing became, because her eyesight left her, etc., became a problem. And the last few months or years were a problem, because we could no longer play Scrabble. And but thank God I kept up the visits. I mean, the last time I visited her, I nearly didn't go because it was pouring with rain, I don't know. But thank God I went, because that was the last time. But she had this unspeakable optimism which nearly drove me crazy. Everything was beautiful. Not everything is beautiful, as we well know. But she kept that going till the very end. Yeah. No, she was certainly a one-off lady, Mrs. Sommer.
How important would you think was the influence of émigré musicians on musical life in Britain?
I think it was very important. I think it was very important. Although I think one underestimates sometimes, I mean, there isn't really a tradition in England, I think, like there was certainly in Germany to put chamber music at home, etc., etc. But there is a lot of talent in England. But I think this, which I hated these competitions, this Young Musician of the Year, but they do fish out very talented people from all over the place. There's no getting away from that. It's possible that the continental influence here has helped along this thing of actually making music an important thing. I'm not sure that it has somehow gone really, isn't pursued properly, how important music really is to be taught at schools. Unfortunately, there's so little culture going on now that people think, oh, this is a waste of time. We need math and, Little do people know how important it is for every child to play a musical instrument, even if it doesn't become a musician. Because it focuses things in you which you normally do. It's quite interesting. My son, for instance, was very mediocre at school. He was okay. The moment he concentrated on the cello, everything got better. I don't think people know. I think continental people probably had a big influence on making music an important thing. I mean, look at Amadeus. Where do they come from, these boys? A lot of people go back to a tradition which perhaps was not necessarily an English tradition. But I don't know that I can be sure that this is so, but it is my impression that refugees had a big influence on the cultural life here.
There is nobody better placed than you to testify to the barbarism that the human race can get up to. Do you think that music can play a role in preventing something like the Holocaust ever happening again?
It's a big question. It's a big question. I mean, you know about Daniel Barenboim's, for instance, attempt, with the East-West divan to bring together, people who hate each other to play music together, whether it will actually prevent disasters. I hope so. But I mean, it's something fantastic that people who won't actually talk to each other and maybe hate each other traditionally sit in front of a piece of music and have the same problem to actually decipher it and play it. One would have thought that it's the most wonderful way of bringing people together. Look, I can say I hope it could work, but I'm a little bit skeptical. I mean, look at the world now. I mean, we teach the Holocaust, we teach this, we teach that, and we can teach till we're blue in the face, but whether we actually learn anything is another matter. But we can try.